Welcome to Not Another Sports Show, NASRadicalSports.com, a radical look at the world of sports. Our show is available for broadcast on college and community radio stations, low-power FM stations, and at over the 180 stations of the Pacifica Radio Network. If you can't listen live or happen to miss any of today's show, you can get access by subscribing to our podcast feed on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, or the Google Play Store. Editions of our broadcast are also available at NASRadicalSports.com. Send us your feedback, your thoughts about program coverage, your ideas for future shows, and updates to @NASRadioSports on Twitter, Facebook.com/NotAnotherSportsShow, NASRadicalSports@gmail.com, or the NASRadicalSports.com contact page. We're going to start off this week's show with some good news, as Loyola's non-tenure track faculty have an agreement on their first contract, so big congratulations there. A lot of attention got paid to the men's basketball team as they made the Final Four, not nearly as much to the non-tenure track faculty who were laboring without a contract and the school trying to play hardball with the non-tenure track professors there. So very good news to see that happening. Meanwhile, in NFL news, free agent quarterback Colin Kaepernick received the 2018 Ambassador of Conscience Award from Amnesty International for his take-a-knee protests during the national anthem, highlighting the issue of police killings. And this is a major international award that took place. He gave a very, very powerful speech highlighting a number of issues. And it's been deeply amusing to me to watch the conservatives contort themselves into a tizzy talking about how Amnesty International is now somehow bad or somehow wrong for giving this award out. That when it comes to countries full of black and brown people that the U.S. is thinking about invading or wants to have a military action against, then all the human rights discussions, all of the looks of human rights by Amnesty International come full bore right to the front, talking about how those countries are violating human rights, that we have this very real issue that needs to get addressed and needs to get dealt with, and that Amnesty International is right there and totally accurate in all of those countries. But Amnesty International starts saying things about police killing a lot of unarmed people here in the country and it really being a civil rights issue, especially because the officers very rarely, if ever, face any charges for what they've done. Then all of a sudden, there's problems with the institution of Amnesty International, that there's all sorts of problems and bad things that happen with Amnesty International. Or they talk about how Colin Kaepernick was unpatriotic in what he did, and that he should have found a better way to protest. Well, if he wants to find a better way to protest, then please tell me what this better way to protest would be. Tell me what this magical better way to protest is. Because if it's direct action, we have conservatives getting mad. If it's standing up, conservatives get mad. If it's demonstrations, conservatives get mad. If it's sitting down, conservatives get mad. That essentially this is all just a movement where they want people to sit down and shut up and accept an unjust status quo. That's the issue here. That we have people who want people of color and their allies to sit down and shut up and accept an unjust status quo, and that's a very real problem. And big props to Colin Kaepernick for winning the 2018 Ambassador of Conscience Award. He may never play another NFL game, and that's a problem. What does that say about the NFL that they don't want this guy in the league? What does it say about the NFL that as of this recording, the NFL still hasn't put a single thing up on their website about their free agent football player getting a major award from an international organization like Amnesty International? What does that say about their priorities? What does it say about the priorities of teams who are more apt to sign guys who have domestic violence abuse issues, spousal violence, sexual violence cases, that they have all of these other issues that they can sign and still be seen as capable ball players, but Colin Kaepernick takes a seat during a song somebody likes to protest horrendous injustices, and somehow that's the bridge too far. That just goes a bit too far in pushing out any kind of major ideas. And it's a real shame that the NFL has pushed this kind of thing out there And it's, also something that later on in the show, when we talk about the discussion of the pardon for the late boxer Jack Johnson, that we're going to get into in more news. But let's go into the NBA news, because we are in the heart of the playoffs, and so let's start talking some NBA news. In NBA news this week, the San Antonio Spurs are in the news, and no, not because Kawhi Leonard has essentially been MIA for most of that series, but because of the recent spate of articles, this one being the San Antonio Spurs edition of the poor little snowflake Trump supporters are mad that people are calling his overt neo-Nazi-based neo-Nazi stories, or trying to make them sound sympathetic, that they just want the politics to go away and them to be able to enjoy their sports without having to think about political issues. And an article that was written talked about a number of Spurs fans taking issue with their coach, Greg Popovich, telling the newspaper that, quote, "After all those years supporting the team, and now I just have no interest, Popovich really messed up. He's there to coach and entertain," close quote. "It is sad that Pop basically told my wife and my son and me that, for that matter, that we are fools for supporting Donald Trump. What happens when someone calls you a fool? You avoid them." Another woman said, "I took it personally. I was such a loyal fan and he insulted me. Why would you start attacking the people who have been so loyal?" And then another fan talked about how she filled up a garbage bag with Spurs gear and Spurs materials that she had around her house, saying, quote, "That's how angry I got. It ruined my basketball life," close quote. Another one said, quote, "I often curse Pop for doing what he did. He insulted more than half the Spurs fan base and no sign whatsoever of an apology." One of the other fans said, "I refuse to go to a game right now or even watch on TV. I was really hurt by what he said. He's basically accusing all the people who voted this one way of being racist and misogynist. It feels very personal. I'm hoping things will change. Maybe they will end up with a new coach who doesn't feel the need to talk politics. I just want to watch basketball," close quote. Yeah, guess what? And a lot of people in this country just want to be able to live. A lot of people in this country just want to be able to live, but they can't because we have police going and killing unarmed people in this community. That's what we have. We have the fact that I can sit on this radio show and I can tell you, hey, remember when the police killed that unarmed black guy? No, not that one, the other one. 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 And we could sit here for another good 15 minutes of airtime, and I could keep doing that, and you could keep supplying the names of more and more individuals. And that's sick, and it's disgusting, and it's problematic, and it's ruined a whole lot more than people's basketball lives. And for them to start talking about how they just want to watch basketball. Well, a lot of people in this country just want to live in a country that has justice for all the people in it. Where police, if they kill someone by shooting an unarmed person in the back multiple times, perhaps, just maybe they can get charged with a crime for that. Maybe they can just get charged with a crime, if not always convicted of a crime for it. But to say that this feels very personal for you because he talked about the guy you voted for. No, what's personal is the people who lost their family. That the daughter of Oscar Grant's kids no longer get to go see their dad. That Erica Garner's kid no longer gets to go see her grandfather. That these are instances, and this is just a small case. That's when it feels personal. That's when it's personal. When people don't get to see their sons, their daughters, their mothers, their fathers, because they've been taken away by police violence. That's when it gets personal. And to talk about it ruined your basketball life. Aww. It ruined your basketball life to be told that you voted for a guy who had really horrendous policies, that wanted to see innocent people like the Central Park Five get the death penalty, even though they didn't actually commit any real crime. That's the issue here. And to say you took it personally and that you were insulted. Why would you attack people who have been loyal? He didn't attack you as a fan. He attacked your poor politics. That's what he attacked. He attacked the politics of reactionary ideas. The politics of white supremacy, the politics of disgusting behavior, of xenophobia, of sexism, of overt racism, of overt white supremacy. That's what happens. And when someone calls you a fool, you avoid them. No, smart people would look at, why did he call me a fool, and was I indeed actually foolish? And Popovich didn't really mess up. He's not just there to coach and entertain. These athletes and these coaches are not just automatons here to, create value for you. They're more than entertainers. They are more than just the cogs out there for your enjoyment and entertainment. They are flesh and blood human beings who have thoughts and perceptions about the world in which they live and the decisions that are made in the world in which they live that impact them, that impact their families, that impact their friends, and impact their fan bases. That's the issue here, and it gets real frustrating to see these sorts of articles talking about humanizing these fans, that they just want to sit down and watch basketball. Yeah, well, a whole lot of people in this country just want to sit down and actually have justice. That we want to have the familiarity that if an officer commits a murder, that officer is going to be held accountable for that murder, rather than just having it, wiped off their record after they get a brief vacation and we know that no charges are going to be filed. That's the issue here. They may want to watch basketball, we want justice, and that's the real problem here, and Pop is very much talking about that, and our condolences to the family of Greg Popovich, as he is, of course, dealing with the death of his wife, and us talking about this kind of story of these fans who are mad that their coach isn't just going out there and entertaining them, and their team isn't just going out there and entertaining them, that they're daring to be human. And that's the issue here. That's the real issue here. That when athletes go and do anything else other than just producing on the court or producing on the field, we get this very real pushback against it, that we want these people to stay just stuck in a small area, stuck in a very small space, and, the shut up and dribble line, to steal one from Laura Ingraham. That we want that, but not to have these athletes speak out about the world in which they live and highlight the platform in which they live. Yet, at the same time, we've deified and Santa Clausified major individuals like the one that we'll be talking about here in just a moment in Major League Baseball news. April 15th, of course, brought Major League Baseball's Jackie Robinson Day, and Jackie Robinson is a person that's been deified, sanctified, and almost Santa Clausified in the world of sports and politics. The person that can essentially do no wrong and, quote-unquote, did things the right way, did things the patriotic way, the way you're supposed to do things. Yet, if he was alive today, they would still be very mad at him, and it would certainly be a much different story. Or if these people were alive when Robinson was integrating Major League Baseball, they probably would have a much different view. Because we tend to think of these things in a very simplistic mantra of segregation, integration, celebration. That once Robinson came in, everything's magically fixed. Or once that we had a black president, everything's magically fixed. But this is still a very significant issue. And Robinson is a man that was born in 1919 in incredible poverty. His father deserted the family, and he came from a family of athletes, but also politically minded athletes. His brother Mac earned a silver medal in the 1936 Olympics, yet when he came back, he only was able to find a job as a street sweeper. And the local white community found him to be very provocative because he swept the streets wearing the Olympic jacket that he got when he won his silver medal in the 1936 games. That he was good enough to go over and win a medal for his country, but then denied equal rights when he got back home. Jackie earned sports scholarships in UCLA to football and baseball, And he frequently, in high school and in his early college career, had to deal with racist fans and police officers hassling African Americans, and he was very much on the front lines in pushing back against racist policing. When he was in the Army, he was court-martialed for not giving up his seat, and he almost faced a second court-martial when a white officer called a random black private a racist slur. Jackie told the officer, quote, "You shouldn't speak to an officer in those terms." The officer responded, "Oh, well, F you too," and then called Jackie a racial slur, and Jackie hit him. And he was nearly court-martialed. Ultimately, he was allowed to be transferred to another place and eventually served out the rest of his time there. So this is a guy who, already we're seeing he didn't suffer abuses lightly. He didn't suffer racist pushback against his humanity very lightly, or not taking it, very lightly coming from people. In baseball in 1945, we tend to think of Branch Rickey, the Brooklyn Dodgers general manager, targeting him as the player to break out. And this is, of course, a decade before Martin Luther King Jr. and nonviolence. He's being asked to be the face of nonviolent in the face of overt racial oppression. And we come to think of this as Robinson having to, quote-unquote, do things the right way. But the issue was that he wasn't supposed to go it alone. Some information has come out that Branch Rickey was hoping to bring in multiple players for it, but New York politics made it such an issue that he had to rush and just sign Robinson so he could be known as the man who desegregated baseball. We see a number of issues happening within the team itself, and even then, and tell me, does this sound like a man who is the face of non-violence and the face of, quote-unquote, doing things the right way? Quote, "I just tried to play ball and ignore the insults, but it was really getting to me. For one wild and crazed moment, I thought, to hell with Mr. Rickey's noble experiment, to hell with the image of the patient black freak I was supposed to create. I could throw down my bat, stride over to that Phillies dugout, grab one of those white SOBs, and smash his teeth in with my despised black fist. Then I could walk away from it all." Does that sound like the guy that we think of doing things the right way? Now, the fans, of course, were pushing back, and the team figured that out, and the teammates realized that he couldn't fight back, and so they converged and stopped a lot of the racial taunts and started to stand up for Robinson, recognizing that he was not able to necessarily do that during his rookie season. In the subsequent seasons, Robinson's actually given much more free rein to play the style that he normally played. If someone spiked him on the base pass, he would spike them back. If someone was playing a little bit dirty, he had the full rein to go out and do something about it on the base paths. And that's what we start to see in Robinson's later career. This was not the patient black freak as he had to become, as he self-described, in quote-unquote doing things the right way, but instead getting to actually able to argue with the umps, to go forward and advocate in a policy of how he normally wanted to act, how he normally decided that he was going to act. And this is also a guy, when we sit there and talk about, patriotism and doing things the right way and putting in the face of doing things the right way, that we keep throwing up Martin Luther King, we keep throwing up people like Jackie Robinson. Well, let's not forget this statement, quote, "I cannot stand and sing the anthem. I cannot salute the flag. I know that I am a black man in a white world." Jackie Robinson from 1972 in his book, I Never Had It Made. "I cannot stand and sing the anthem. I cannot salute the flag. I know that I'm a black man in a white world." But this is the man that's Santa Clausified and deified almost as doing things the right way from whites who simply don't want to be bothered. It's not that they, if they found this information out, they would also then say that Jackie Robinson didn't do things the patriotic right way, and he should have found another way to do things, and he should have found another way to be effective. Because that's the sole issue here. They're constantly wanting to find other ways to be effective and other ways to do things. Essentially, they want other ways to not have to be bothered with racial injustice. That's what they largely want, is other ways to not have to be bothered, to not actually have to care about the lack of justice injustice for way too many people in our community. And when you have people like Jackie Robinson here, the week of this Jackie Robinson Day, April 15th, 1947, highlighting the exact facts that Robinson also said explicitly he could not stand for the anthem because of the racial injustice that was happening. That years later, we're still having these discussions, and then we're bringing up Robinson to try to discredit so many of the athletes who are standing on the shoulders of Robinson to push forward this kind of political sports agenda. Meanwhile, in college sports news, Florida State is back in the news. And sure, the police don't have all that great investigations when it came to Jameis Winston and the possibilities that, he might have engaged in some inappropriate sexual conduct, but allegations that the now starting quarterback is moving pounds of marijuana? A 2-month investigation goes forward by the Florida State Police. And they went through his trash, and they eventually searched his house. This is so much more than they did during the Jameis Winston investigation. The fact that they had a 2-month investigation and did interviews and did searches and actually showed up to places and did work is so much more than they did during the Jameis Winston investigation. And all of this yielded a half an ounce of marijuana. Oh no, a college kid had a half an ounce of marijuana. Oh, the humanity. Oh, the injustice. He's been offered a chance to participate in a pretrial diversion program and has to do community service and avoid any kind of criminal activity for the next year. And this is the issue here. That, what does this say that this was a priority for the police? 2 months of an investigation. 2 months of going through this guy's trash. 2 months of police power being spent on this. Now, given all the things that police could be doing, like killing unarmed black people and killing unarmed poor people, I'll take them sorting through trash. But what does this say about the prioritization of policing and the ideas of policing in general? That they've prioritized the drug war. They've prioritized asset forfeiture as a metric of enriching police departments. Because when police are able to score assets through asset forfeiture, they go to the police. So there is a financial incentive, a monetary incentive to push forward on these issues of the drug war. Are there no other offenses that are happening that are worth 2 months of an investigation? What does this say about not only prioritization of policing, but policing in general? That we have this as such an issue. That they spent 2 months investigating to find a half an ounce of pot, and then the headline being, college student found with half an ounce of pot. It ranks right up there with the amount of groundbreaking headlines like, some kids walk to school, others ride the bus. Meanwhile, former quarterback Shea Patterson of Ole Miss unloaded a 9-page letter after Ole Miss has challenged his transfer waiver. He recently transferred to Michigan, and Ole Miss wants him to have to wait out a year before he can actually play. And because Ole Miss is challenging his transfer waiver, because he wants to play immediately, he sent a 9-page letter to the media. They haven't printed the whole thing, but they did print major parts of it in the major key aspects of his argument. He alleges that then-coach Hugh Freeze and the athletic director Ross Bjork lied to the team, including him, multiple times. The team is facing a 2-year postseason ban for violations because some of the players got paid. Patterson also alleges that they were told by Freeze and Bjork that the violations happened under the tenure of Houston Nutt as the head coach. When this was made up to journalists, Nutt fired back, and Freeze ended up having to resign when it was found out that he was calling escorts while on recruiting visits. And so we're certainly going to have to wait and see if Patterson does have to wait the 1 year to be immediately eligible or not. Because coaches can freely move without any kind of punishment, but if Shea Patterson moves because the school had allegedly lied to him on a multitude of occasions and is facing punishments for something that they didn't do but the higher-ups above him did, he may have to sit out a year. Because NCAA fairness, everybody. The NCAA's fairness. And now it's time for our last segment, coming up with our roundup of other sports news. This week also sees the anniversary of the first woman running in the Boston Marathon. In 1967, Kathrine Switzer registered for the marathon as KV Switzer and became the first woman to run with a race number. As in 1966, Roberta Gibb hid in a bush at the start line and ran the race as an unregistered person. 2 miles into KV Switzer's first run, the marathon officials attempted to kick her out of the race, in fact, running up, and there's photos of them trying to steal the bib off of her shirt. However, a number of running mates, including her partner, were able to keep the official off of her, and she finished the race in 4 hours, 20 minutes. And 5 years later, 1972, women were finally allowed to participate. So big props to Kathrine Switzer there. In soccer news, Russia has more homophobic abuse happening in advance of the World Cup coming in 2018. That the Vladivostok and Fakel Voronezh teams were facing off each other, and to push back against Vladivostok's coach, the fans threw a rooster at him, which is a term of homophobic abuse in Russia, and it was widely seen as an act of homophobic abuse. FIFA has not only charged the Russian Football Union with these homophobic issues, but now racism after monkey chants were uttered towards black French players during a friendly there last month. This is the third time this season that there has been an act of racism at St. Petersburg Stadium. And the home team there, Zenit St. Petersburg, has had a banner praising the war criminal Radko Mladic and has a history of racist abuse. A fan letter that was put out as a manifesto of the fans argued for an all-white team and tried to justify bigotry of the team maintaining a racist presence on the pitch. And so really, really horrible stuff there. And of course, FIFA, not necessarily caring about human rights, is more than happy to give them the World Cup in 2018 without so much as a mumbling word about it. Lance Armstrong has settled a suit with the U.S. government for $5 million, as the U.S. Postal Service was a major sponsor, and then it came out that he was using performance-enhancing drugs and they want their money back. Armstrong claimed that he doesn't owe the Postal Service anything because the agency made far much more money off of the sponsorship than it actually paid in, that the benefits, according to his lawyers, topped over $100 million. And that's the issue here, too, that Lance Armstrong and PEDs, and this has become, the big issue of PEDs and whether or not he should have to pay back all of this money. Well, they got all the benefits out of it, and now that they want to claim that they're wrong, they're going after Lance Armstrong, and they're going after a number of these individuals. Trigger warning, we are going to be talking about issues of sexual violence and sexual abuse in this next story. USA Gymnastics has had gymnasts testifying in front of the Senate this week, talking about the scandal and what USA Gymnastics needs to do to try to handle this scandal. Gold medalist Jordan Weber highlighted the higher-ups at USA Gymnastics and in the Olympic Committee and said, quote, "I don't think they're innocent at all. They've seen things and they have culpability." And USA Gymnastics, after this Senate hearing, reached a confidential settlement with the first suit by a former gymnast who said her coach secretly taped her changing, and this coach is now currently serving a 30-year prison sentence. The suit showed that, quote, USA Gymnastics had an internal policy of not forwarding allegations of child sex abuse to authorities. It also revealed that executives at the sports organization signed by a victim or complaint files on at least 54 coaches during a 10-year period ending in 2006, close quote. The coach was accused in the late 1990s, but then got to coach for almost 7 more years until a woman went to the FBI with emails that were sent by him to her 11-year-old daughter. I think Jordan Weber's got it right. I don't think they're innocent at all. They've seen things, and they have culpability. In boxing news, the first black heavyweight champion, Jack Johnson, who was charged under the Mann Act for traveling with his white wife in 1913 and faced the criminal charge, there has been a big push to get him a posthumous pardon. President Donald Trump said recently, quote, Sylvester Stallone called me with the story of heavyweight boxing champion Jack Johnson. His trials and tribulations were great, his life complex and controversial. Others have looked at this over the years. Most thought it would be done, but yes, I'm considering a full pardon, close quote. The irony of all this is that Trump advocated for a group of black and brown people to be killed without evidence pointing to their guilt, the Central Park Five. The guy whose mere existence challenged all sorts of racial mores is expected to be getting a pardon from a guy who advocated that a group of people, sans evidence, should be getting the death penalty. If Johnson was alive, Trump would be going apoplectic about him. Look at how he and Pence and others have spoken out about people of color arguing for things. Both celebrities and not celebrities. To use the bully pulpit so literally in this. And that's the real problem here. Keep Jack Johnson's name out your mouth. It's not gonna... It should not be a tool of, look at how not racist we are by pardoning a guy from 1913 for a crime while actively engaging in policies that harm people of color and very overtly pushing back against people of color and activist athletes today. That's the real problem here, that we have such a very real issue with people getting this kind of pushback against athletes today, while going back and saying that they're champions of Jackie Robinson, or that they're going to be champions of Jack Johnson, and that this has become a tool for these quote-unquote anti-racists to really just say, look at how not racist I am because I'm in favor of this, when it's really just a tool to deflect on very serious issues, and that's the real problem here. And we recently did an interview with Professor Lewis Moore about black boxers, including Jack Johnson, in his book, I Fight for a Living, Boxing in the Battle for Black Manhood, 1880 to 1915. And so we are going to replay that interview that we did with Professor Lewis Moore, because knowing about Jack Johnson is very, very important, and it's even more important now. So Jack Johnson's life, his legacy, is authentically utilized and authentically used, and does not become just a pawn for a look how not racist I am move by the current administration. Because so much of his policies have drastically undercut any idea of anti-racist stuff coming out of this current White House. So we're going to jump to that interview that we did in December 2017 with Professor Lewis Moore about boxer Jack Johnson and other black boxers in I Fight for a Living, Boxing in the Battle for Black Manhood, 1880 to 1915. You're listening to Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, Left Sports Radio, and we are on the line with Professor Lewis Moore, who is an associate professor of history at Grand Valley State University with a focus on gender history, African American history, and sports history. He is the author of We Will Win the Day, The Civil Rights Movement, the Black Athlete, and the Quest for Equality, as well as the book that we'll be talking about today, I Fight for a Living, Boxing in the Battle for Black Manhood, 1880 to 1915. So thank you very much, Professor Moore, for being able to come on the show with us.
Thanks for having me.
A lot of books about boxing of this era, especially about boxers of color, tend to focus mostly on the life or the championship reign of Jack Johnson. But your book made the very obvious decision to focus on a number of boxers of that era. Why was that decision made, and how did that factor into your decision to title the book I Fight for a Living?
When I originally started this project, it was about Jack Johnson. So everything started as an undergrad. I had an opportunity to write a paper about the Jack Johnson-Jim Jeffries fight. But then as I got more into the project, I realized, there's so much more than Jack Johnson. So each fighter I came across, I wanted to know where they from, who they fought. And then you just keep digging, and then eventually you keep going backwards, right? And so I started at 1880 because that's when you see a lot of these black fighters come up. And what I wanted to do is, since I always wanted to talk about Jack Johnson, I wanted to talk about the other fighters too. So how does Jack Johnson fit into this picture, and how do these other fighters fit into this picture? And what I discovered is he's like these other guys. So if he's like these other guys, how do I get that information out to let the readers know that there are a number of Jack Johnsons out there. So that was like the main goal of this project.
And the decision to call this "I Fight for a Living," that this was a class issue as well, right?
Right. What I discovered along the way is that this was a job for these guys, and these guys talked about it as a job. They had open conversations about investment. They had open conversations about their family. They had open conversations about this was what they were doing for their living. Originally, it wasn't that title; it was Beyond the Battle Royal, but the publishers thought that wasn't good enough, and so within I think about a minute of receiving that email, I thought, you know what? I start off with a guy talking about he fights for a living, so why don't I just title "I Fight for a Living"?
And permeating the book was a lot of discussion of these athletes talking about their families, talking about their ownership of gymnasiums, and using that to kind of show the respectability that they can be what was expected of being a man, and the implementation of respectability politics. How did that idea of respectability politics affect boxers' lifestyle choices and their embrace or lack thereof from black leaders at the time? And how did these attitudes of acceptance or not start to shift for fighters over time?
I think from the beginning, once these guys got money, they wanted to live this comfortable lifestyle. And so that's where you see them. Most of these guys, the ones who made money, a lot of money, they went and bought, a house, they got married, and they eventually tried to make investments. But at the same time, what I tried to explain is that these guys come from this culture where you drink a lot, you gamble a lot, you fight a lot, and you hang out with the fellas. You buy them a lot of stuff, and most of them struggle to get away from that. So they were doing. I say they straddled the line. They were doing both things, right? They're living this sporting lifestyle, where on the one hand their manhood was recognized within these other sporting men, and then they were also aspiring to be like these middle class black leaders. And to your second point is that these middle class black leaders looked down on most of them for a while. They didn't like the way they gambled. They didn't like the fact that these guys were fighting and getting most of the attention in the black community. But what happens is around the late 1880s, this guy, Peter Jackson, who's the top heavyweight in all the world, doesn't get a chance to fight for the heavyweight championship because of racism. But the black middle class fell in love with him because they realized that he had the kind of respectability that they had too, right? He dressed well. He reportedly spoke a number of languages, and they liked that about him. And he was also a great fighter. And then what you'll see is that they gravitate more and more towards sports, and they start to see that some of these things that these athletes do, like hard work, this idea that sports is also about meritocracy, they like that because that's how they see America is supposed to be. If you work hard and if you get a fair chance, then we'll also succeed. So they take what these athletes do inside the ring, the hard work, the success they have, and they want it to be part of their lives too. Now, if we expand this on in sports, this is what we see a lot with black community in sports, whether you're talking about Jackie Robinson or you're talking about someone with Bill Russell. But specifically when it comes to these boxers and their lifestyle, they've never really got away from that. So you'll see several boxers talk about investments, but you'll also see these boxers who throw around money. And so at the end, the epilogue, I end with Floyd Mayweather, who kind of does both. He invests a lot of money, so he has a lot of money wrapped up in property, but he also throws a lot of it away.
And the straddling of that line of when it seemed advantageous to amplify their in-ring successes, especially when they were fighting against white fighters, and showing that this was going to be racial uplift, while at the same time, if any of those fighters did happen to do something disreputable outside the ring, of either ignoring that or piling on overtly with the kind of shame politics of the lack of respectability. Can you kind of explain more of that?
Yeah, so it's a double-edged sword for these guys. On the one hand, they love the black middle class loves when these black fighters defeat a white man, right? Because so much about boxing, what's going on is that a lot of white onlookers are using boxing as saying, well, see, we're the more superior race. That's why we have all the championships. But once you start to see that white fighters are forced to fight black men and black men win the majority of the contests, the black middle class is saying, aha, maybe you're not, the superior race. However, these fighters still live that lifestyle. And a good example I use is George Dixon. George Dixon, first black champion. He weighs about 113 pounds when he wins the championship in 1890. So he's a pretty much hero in the early 1890s. He dies penniless and alcoholic in 1908. And when he dies, the black middle class pile on him. And they said, this is a lesson. Don't be like this guy. When you have an opportunity to save your money, live the right way. Now, 8 years before that, when he's champion, they're celebrating him. Like, live like George Dixon, right? Work hard, and you too will succeed. You'll be able to, to defeat the color line. But again, once he messes up, they're like, look, this is a lesson for the rest of you guys to follow. Don't be like him.
And as your research progressed, did you see any kind of connection in the usage of battle royals getting used on undercards as a reaction to reinforce white supremacist or white superiority on cards where black fighters were finding increased success in the ring?
Yeah, one of the things I talk about in Chapter 6 is I try to put boxing and the law and race in the progressive era. And so there's always been kind of like battle royals, and someone like a Joe Gantz came up in battle royals, Jack Johnson came up in battle royals. But what you'll see is starting in the early 1900s, you'll see more and more of these battle royals. And what you see is that as promoters and politicians start to worry about black men defeating white men in the ring, they'll start to get more of these fights, right? So it's kind of like they're using this to assuage their own fears, because again, boxing proves superiority, it proves manhood, and what better way to counter that than to have four guys blindfolded just swinging at each other, desperately, and as the white fans mock them. So you'll see this in Baltimore, you'll see this in Los Angeles, you'll see this in other cities, where outside the South too, where more and more promoters will turn to this.
And the press was used to reinforce some of the white superiority, white supremacy, its very close tangent, the trope of the exceptional black athlete, proving that racial advancement was possible even in the overt face of racism and inequality. How is this also a space where black athletes were also able to undermine or challenge that same kind of white supremacist mindset?
So on the one hand, just when they're talking, right, we talked about this before, they're talking about investment, talking about family, right? They're proving that, they have these kind of middle class qualities. But when it comes to physicality, talking about training, their training habits, right? Working out, Jack Johnson going to run 12 miles a day, talking about eating right, talking about living right, but also just being in the ring and winning, right? So much about their life and other black people's life at this time is just based on this idea that black people are inferior. And when they get the opportunity to show, right, to prove it against somebody one-on-one, your body's exposed, you're wearing very short shorts, every your muscles are there, there's no help outside the ring, there's no Jim Crow, it's you against this other guy. And for the most part, black fighters come out on the top. I think when I studied Los Angeles, and I did a stat between like 1900 and 1903. They wound up stopping interracial fights around 1904. But out of all the main event fighters between black and white fights, a black fighter only lost one fight. And that was on a controversial decision. And so they're knocking these white fighters out. And what happens in Los Angeles is that because black fighters beat white fighters too many times, is fans start to complain that the promoter's putting on too many of these fights. And also the city forces the promoter's name's Tom McQuarrie, to stop interracial matches, and he stops for about 4 years.
And the efforts of the press to start talking about the physicality of black fighters and framing this largely as the physicality or the reference to the old trope of the little black Sambo, as you noted, the passive, dim-witted, happy-go-lucky throwbacks to the old days of slavery, and focusing on that kind of almost animalistic style of raw athleticism. And how they also paired that with after Jeffries was beaten by Jack Johnson, where they said that Jeffries was, quote, destroyed by his superiority in everything but the one vital thing and the understanding of the black man from the Congo. How were they able to highlight both the racial superiority aspects of winning fights, but even assessing racial superiority even when they're losing fights?
Yeah, Yes, it's things you do, right, to not admit that everything you've been telling yourself isn't true. But that's what they do, right? So I use an example of someone like a Sam Langford, who clearly was, if not the best fighter, the second best fighter, regardless of size. And they'll marvel at his body, and then once they see that he's beating these white fighters, this is when you'll start to see them calling him Sambo, calling him a savage, saying that he's very ape-like, and then they're doing this, right? Because on the one hand, physicality is kind of based on this kind of savageness, right? This primitive savageness, right? But on the other hand, what white people tell themselves is that they're morally superior because they could train this. They have this under control, right? Um, but what they're saying is that these black guys, they might beat us, but the only reason why they're beating us is because they're straight savage. There is no control, there is no modernity to them. They're just straight from the jungles of Africa, and maybe that's why we can't beat them. So you admit to their physical superiority, but you don't let it go any further. You just say that's it for you. You're a savage. You might have physical superiority, but it's because you're a savage, and not because that you're morally superior, not because of anything about modernity, about how hard you work, right? How hard you train. It's all about you being back to primitive man.
And do you think we kind of see echoes of this in the way that modern day press focuses on the athleticism of athletes of color while glorifying the supposedly more intellectual play of describing white athletes, or white athletes, quote unquote, doing things the right way? Because reading this really started to remind me of some of the way that we see frames for modern athletes, especially like quarterbacks in the NFL, for instance, and how the media treats them with the kinds of frames that they use. It reminded me a lot of David Leonard's research in Playing While White. Do you see any echoes in how modern day media portrays athletes based on race with some of the work that you've done?
Yeah, I think especially with the black athlete, right? It's rare that we allow them to move beyond just the athlete. And when we do allow them to move beyond an athlete, right, I think a lot of times the media does it as a way to say something to other black athletes, right? So we'll celebrate Russell Wilson, right, because he's quote unquote polished, right? But then when you talk about his game, it's still this kind of free flow, this athletic game. He doesn't think, he's just out there kind of winging it. Um, and what I try to do with a lot of this stuff is as you suggest, is put it out there without really putting it out there, right? So people can draw their own conclusions, and like you, that's one of the conclusions I drew when I'm reading this. Like, this is the same thing that we see. It's just that at the turn of the century, they're very explicit about it, right? They'll tell you this guy's an animal. Nowadays they'll just say natural athlete. And so the language has changed a little bit, but like I said, specifically with the black athletes, I don't think much has changed about how we talk about them.
And in the text, you mentioned examples like Mayor Hayes in Baltimore with his election, and that connection between the progressive ideas of politics and good government also being with banning interracial boxing and reinforcing white supremacy. How was it that the progressive era and the politics of it near turn of the century was also used to, at the same time, prevent racial equality and reinforce white supremacy in a number of cities?
So yeah, specifically we're talking about chapter 6, and in that chapter I look at Baltimore, Los Angeles. I touch a little bit on Louisville, some on Memphis, and some states like New York and Wisconsin. And what we see is that these politicians are going after these fights because fans are realizing, these white fans are realizing that what they told themselves about black people is just not true. So in Baltimore, someone like Joe Gans, who at that time is the light heavyweight champion of the world, he's fighting nothing but white men in Baltimore, and he's beating them up viciously. And Baltimore at that time, as you mentioned, was marketed itself as a white man city, right? They're taking away black political power, and eventually they'll Jim Crow blacks altogether. And so Joe Gans becomes, interracial fights, and more specifically, Joe Gans becomes this opportunity for him to cement that, to say, wait a minute, we're not giving these guys an inch. And for them, they see that sports is so important and so popular in American society that allowing black men to fight white men is giving them an inch. And so these politicians, the moment they got the opportunity to stop interracial fights, they'll stop interracial fights because they don't want black men in their society to get an idea that they can make it ahead of white people.
Now, did they overtly state that in some of them? Because, like, in the statement you had from the Baltimore mayor talking about how it was just going to engender bad feelings for everybody, that it felt like they were, in practice, engaging in overtly racist behavior, but in the words that they were utilizing to try to put this out there publicly, they were not necessarily making that as overt as the actual policy was. Did you see that in your research, or were they really overt in these statements as to why they were making these bans?
Oh, they were overt. Baltimore, Los Angeles does the same thing in 1903, where they essentially tell the promoter that, look, you can keep promoting fights, but if you want this license, you can't do these interracial fights anymore. Memphis, after Jack Johnson won, the mayor says, look, no more black fighters in the city. They should be working out in the fields. Louisville, as I mentioned, bans black fighters altogether, right? And there's no reason why you'd ban black fighters altogether and black trainers unless there's something explicit that you want to try, like a point you want to try to make. And the same thing with what they call mixed bouts is what you'll see throughout cities and states. They'll explicitly ban mixed bouts, and they're doing this is not because they don't want black men and white men sweating on each other. It's that they just don't want those black men who aren't fighters, right, to get this notion that they can be like these black fighters, right, that they can get one over on white fighters. And the best case of this, and I don't really go much into it because it's pretty popular, is after the Jack Johnson Jim Jeffrey fights, right, you have murders across the country. Black lady gets her tongue shot out. You have the fight films are banned. Eventually, 2 years later, all fight films from across state lines will be banned. And this is all about, making sure people don't see black people, black men beating up white men in the ring.
And we're in an era with a lot of attention being paid to athletes and their stances on political issues, especially with the Take a Knee protests against police violence. And it feels to me like there's a lot of echoes with the past, with the pushback against white supremacy, white superiority, and institutional racism, and what it means to achieve full citizenship in the public sphere. Are there lessons from the past in your study of sports history from this book or We Will Win the Day that you would suggest not only to athletes, but as well to fans in general as we continue to navigate this space and see these reflections of athletes using their platforms to stand up against social injustice?
Yeah, I think what happens with these two books is We Will Win the Day is what happens after, the Jim Crow. So the boxing ring and sports is Jim Crowed rather quickly. And you can see that in other sports. And so to answer that, We Will Win Today is really the best for the audience if you want that, because I lay out that idea of shut up and play to the activist athlete, and I talk about the revolt of the black athlete in two different chapters. Other chapters about democracy in sports and some other things and integration to sports. But the lessons is that there, and I talk about this in other places, that there's power in numbers, right? And I think we see that in, say, like 1965 in New Orleans, when the AFL All-Star game, black players boycott the game in New Orleans and eventually moves to Houston. And it moves to Houston because 22 black players stood together. And what we see today in 2017, the more and more black players in football that get together, the more the NFL has to do something. Whether we disagree with how that $100 million or $87 million, whatever they gave them, or what they're coming up with, how they're using it, they're doing this because they start to fear black labor, and that's the connection. Whether it's the 60s or 2017, is that the more black athletes stand up together collectively and don't let anybody just be out there isolated activist athlete, that's when you'll see the owners start to take notice. That's when you'll see the public start to take notice.
And do you notice any kind of reflections of some of the eras that you've studied of not only activist athletes, but some of the reactionary pushback to athletes speaking out and making these kinds of statements?
Yeah, right. There's always going to be pushback. Always, always, always. And my favorite example is this. So Louisiana in 1956, they put a sports ban on, a mixed sports ban. And even though they already had banned mixed sports, whites and blacks participating against each other, they just decided to do it again for no other reason. And there's a sports writer in New Orleans, and he specifically blames Jackie Robinson for this, right? He said if Jackie Robinson didn't run his mouth about race issues, this wouldn't be a problem. And somehow this gets back to Jackie Robinson. And he writes this long letter just going after this guy, right? About, racism in America and his citizenship and his ability to speak out. And then at the end of the letter, he writes to this guy, he says, I'm glad you were born white, because if not, everything would be hard for you. And it's like this perfect statement, right? On the one hand, the white writer blames Jackie Robinson, blames for the racism of the state. And then Jackie Robinson comes back at him, right, and says, look, I have this right as a citizen to do this, and me doing this makes, America a better place. That's my favorite example, but there's tons of examples, the 68 Olympics, the backlash they received. But it goes, anytime an athlete says something, there's always going to be pushback.
Yeah, it reminded me of one quote from your book where you talked about, if a fight did not meet white fans' expectations, they expected little science and lots of hard punching. Fans believed that black fighters had tricked them. The trickster as a boxer represented a conundrum to whites, because if their suspicions were true, the trickster outsmarted the white fans that expected blacks would only slug each other because blacks supposedly lacked science as fighters, close quote. And that really felt like it's kind of encapsulating how a lot of white fan audiences view athletes, especially athletes of color even today, that they see them solely as uneducated or as thugs or whatever other code words they'd like to use. And when they're speaking out about issues, it kind of leaves them in this conundrum of, wow, they're kind of smart, but that doesn't fit with how I frame them of just being the dumb jock athlete. Do you see some of those overlaps?
Yeah, that's what we call like that kind of shove and play, right? Because when they speak out, right? Well, when they speak out against racism, to be clear, or sexism, it makes fans uncomfortable, right? Because they just want to see these guys slug each other. They just want to see these football players hit each other. But when an athlete speaks out, especially these athletes who have money, who seemingly have everything, who live this life that this white fan wants to live, they don't know what to do, right? Because they're telling the truth about racism in America. And what we're told is that, success makes everything go away. But, when someone like Cap, who has $100 million contract, is saying, no, it doesn't, right? These are these problems, and I want to speak about it. These fans cringe, right? They thought Cap was just this guy with tattoos and throwing the ball and being cool and riding all these expensive cars. And certainly he projected that image. But, dude picked up a lot of books a couple summers ago, started to read it and started to see things differently and wanted to tell us this. And the moment he spoke up, they were like, whoa, like, I don't like this. Please go away. And NFL owners did the same thing. And they essentially blackballed him, right? Because he chose to be somebody who had a conscience, and they didn't want that. They just wanted a quarterback out there throwing and winning games.
Well, if people would like to follow your work or would like to get more information or interact with you on the internet, where can they do that best?
I'm on Twitter sometimes too much, but it's at LouMore12. I often put, as you know, a lot of primary sources, talk a lot about sports and race. You can also just shoot me an email at my moorelou@gvsu. That's MOORELOU @gvsu.edu.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Louis Moore, Associate Professor of History at Grand Valley State University, talking today about sports, politics, and his book, I Fight for a Living, Boxing in the Battle for Black Manhood, 1880 to 1915. Thank you very much, Professor Moore. I really appreciate you taking time out of your evening for us.
And thanks for having me. Thanks for reading the book.
This has been Not Another Sports Show, NASRadicalSports.com, a radical look at the world of sports. Our show is available for broadcast on college and community radio stations, low-power FM stations, and at any over the 180 stations of the Pacifica Radio Network. If you can't listen live or happen to miss any of today's show, you can get access by subscribing to our podcast feed on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play. And editions of our broadcast are also available at NASRadicalSports.com. Send us your feedback, your thoughts about program coverage, your ideas for future shows, and updates to at NAS Radio Sports on Twitter, Facebook.com/NotAnotherSportsShow, NASRadicalSports@gmail.com, or our NASRadicalSports.com contact page. We look forward to hearing from you, and we will catch you next week, sports fans, leftists, progressives, and radicals, to talk about the world of sports, politics, and leftist activism.